So it's been a few days since I finished it, but I did my second playthrough of Fire Emblem Three Houses, and I did one for the Black Eagles, and I thought, well, why not do the trifecta or the quadfecta? Because there is four playthroughs in this game. But regardless, I figured, well, why not go over thoughts for each of the three houses? Because why not? Sounds like a good time. It's been a while since I made a video anyway, which was about as low effort as this one. But what can you do? Blue Lions, what's the deal? Well, if you haven't seen my previous video on the Black Eagles, I was a little disappointed by Three Houses. I didn't feel like it was living up to the hype I was building up for it, which was fine, because I knew it was becoming immonstrable after a certain point. However, playing the Blue Lions, my opinion on the game has significantly risen. I enjoyed the game much more as the Blue Lions as I did the Black Eagles. That being said, I still wouldn't put this in my top 5 favorite Fire Emblem games. I actually did like a tentative list just to kind of get my idea. And this was either like 7 or 8 on my series rankings, which is below the halfway point of all the games, if we're including the remakes. So, yeah, I wouldn't put this in my upper half of the series rankings. That being said, though, these are all still really good games, so that's not a slight against it that it's not in my top 5, or even my upper half. Maybe it might change in the future when I learn to appreciate this game a little bit more. But anyway, let's just jump into it. We'll go over like likes and dislikes for this part of the video. And then eventually I'll be talking about spoilers for this game again. I don't have too much to say in terms of like the non-spoilery stuff, so we'll kind of breeze through that pretty quickly. I don't think I have that much more to say about spoilers either, but we'll get to that when we do. So, non-spoiler likes, let's go. Like I said, my opinions of this game have risen dramatically by just playing the Blue Lions. Because the story, part 1 specifically, makes much more sense from their perspective. This is why I chose the Blue Lions going through this game again, because a lot of the minor villains in part 1 relate back to the Blue Lions in some way or another. Like, we have Leonardo being Ash's adoptive father, Miklon being the brother of Sylvain, and the Death Knight is related to Mercedes somehow. I don't know the connection. I made a mistake, so I didn't get a convo between them, but they are connected, I suppose, so sure. So having that personal connection between the heroes and the villains adds a lot more tension to those moments and to those fights that made them interesting going through again, and having those scenes change depending on who we were talking about. And also to kind of go back and talk to those same students after those chapters to really get their perspective again, because when I was playing the Black Eagles, it's like, okay, I understand these students' pains, but I can't fully relate with that or empathize with that. But playing this game again, it got me to really think about and feel for these characters in a way that I didn't on my first playthrough, so I really enjoyed that. And also another thing I like is that there are a lot more paralogs in this game that relate back to those earlier chapters and villains to help give them a little bit of closure. Like with Ash, you go on a paralogue where you're fighting off the last of the Resistance Leonardo led or whatever to try and get like motives behind what was going on. And with Sylvain, you go on a mission to help rid his father of bandits in the city or whatever. And it helps give them a little bit of closure and wrap those little stories up just a little bit more. So I really appreciated that. So playing through the game again, I was admittedly a little worried about the first part of the game, which is mostly the same as the other playthroughs. However, what helped alleviate that is that characters talk from a different perspective about the same scenes. So, for example, Chapter 3, is it? I think it is before chapter you fight Leonardo, Catherine talks about the tragedy of Dusker a little bit, but in this playthrough, she was talking with a little bit more tact and a little bit just kind of the facts of the situation rather than going into more detail, because that event personally affected Dimitri and some of the other members of the party, so she was trying to be a little bit more careful with her words. So I like how it presented that same scene, but even with the same character from a different side of that argument. And I also got to learn more about how Dimitri is connected with Edelgard and Lord Arundel and his personal connection with him. So that really helped kind of build this world up again as more of a living, breathing place than most other worlds in the Fire Emblem series. So I really appreciated how much time they put into the setting, into the background details, into these characters' like upbringings as well. I don't know why I didn't mention this last time, but I really liked how monsters were implemented in this game. Like Gaiden and Sacred Stones, they were all intents and purposes just an enemy unit. They didn't have standard weapons, but functionally they served the same purpose. Monsters in this game take up more spaces on the board, they're huge, they have shields around them, and you need to penetrate those shields before you can even really do any major damage on them. And then they also have reserve health bars, so when their whole HP depletes, they reset with like a reserve tank, sort of like a Metroid game, and you have to deplete that and then deplete it again, depending on how much health bar the enemy has. I really liked that because it made monsters feel like a legitimate threat, and something that you actually had to do much more strategizing around, rather than just putting knuckles on someone and hitting them for 16 times 4 damage. And I really appreciated how much you really had to work around them, especially because I played this game in hard mode for this playthrough, and hard mode is generally much harder than the normal mode. Like, certain enemies move when they otherwise wouldn't in the previous game, they do more damage. You get the idea. So I actually had to consider and use my gambits more carefully in this route. So playing on the harder difficulties, I appreciated gambits more, which I really didn't in my first playthrough. So that was neat. I'll get back to how I feel about gambits as a system, but otherwise, yeah, I really appreciated monsters in this game. I thought they were an excellent addition. And that's all I have to say for positives that are non-spoilers. I did say I'd be going through these pretty fast. So for non-spoiler dislikes, this game has New Game Plus, and I was really excited when I learned about that. However, I don't really care for the way it was implemented. So to contextualize this, my favorite kinds of New Game Plus is when they give you all the tools and all the experience that you earned in the previous playthrough, and then you can just go nuts destroying the game however you want. Those are my favorite kinds of New Game Plus. However, it's kind of this weird system where some things are carried over, but you basically still have to build yourself up from the bottom up. So I didn't really like that when I first saw it. However, I still find it to be a nice compromise between the system I like the most and the system that works the best for this game. Like, I acknowledge that just being super overpowered right at the start at level 15 with all your level ranks, I understand why that wouldn't work necessarily in this game, and that I still appreciate that you can spend your points to get back the skills and stats that you had in your previous playthroughs. So at least it was compromising between those two styles rather than just including one or disregarding the other, however you want to look at it. So it's not really so much as like I have such an issue with this. It's fine. I don't mind it. It's just not how I personally would have wanted New Game Plus. My other dislike is that combat arts are fine, but I don't like them, really. Because here's the thing, like, early game combat arts are amazing. They give your units the extra push you need to really overcome certain challenges when your units are barely strong enough to take care of themselves. However, by the time that units are doubling, it's like, well, you can either double the enemy for this much damage, or you can use a combat art for only one strike, which is going to be less than if you double. Sometimes I can see why a combat art would be more useful. However, it's much more valuable to have units doubling than it is to use combat arts, especially because combat arts take up weapon durability. But even then, weapon durability isn't so important in this game because you can actually repair your weapons. So it's not really so much of a taxing decision. So I really don't like the way combat arts were implemented in this game. I think if they were more powerful and if they still consumed HP like with Shadows of Valentia, I would have liked their inclusion more. However, it's okay. They're fine, but that's it. They're just fine. It's not something I ever want to use or rely on using. I think my biggest problem with this game from a gameplay perspective is the aggro lines. So, for direct comparison with another game on Switch, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, they have the aggro lines going from the enemies to your player characters to show which enemy is attacking which character, of course, right? They use a similar system here, where once you move a unit to their position for the turn, if an enemy is in range and going to attack that unit on enemy phase, it'll show you the aggro lines for which enemies are going to attack which characters. Or at least which ones they'll prioritize first, if they can attack them. And I don't like this system because it takes away all the elements of surprise from enemy phase. So one of the more exciting parts of playing other Fire Emblem games, maybe not the most enjoyable, but one of the parts I find the most fascinating is when you move your units for the turn, but the enemy exploits some weakness in your formation or sees something that you didn't, whether you have enough movement to move around your flank or whatever have you, or a unit just being weaker than you thought they were. It's exciting to see those enemies take advantages of your weaknesses like that, and to not know until the moment it happens. But with these aggro lines, it removes all the mystery. And it's something that I noticed more in this playthrough than I did my first one. And I planned my strategies around those, and if it wasn't working, I would define Pulse back to an earlier part of the battle, and then reshuffle the units there. So because of that, I was much more conscious of the moves the enemy was going to make, rather than the moves the enemy had already made. So I didn't like it for that reason. It felt a little less strategic, if that is weird enough to say. Because I wasn't planning for a possible failure that could happen, I was planning for the failures that were about to happen. So I don't like the aggro lines. I was looking for options to see if I could turn them off, and I can't. There is a lack of options in this game too, where other games succeeded. So I wish that there was just an option to toggle it off, but there isn't. So Intelligent Systems, if you're going to patch this game, I would really like if you could have the option to turn those off. Please. And this is my... both of these last two negatives are kind of intertwined. So my negative to start out is that this game is too long. I don't remember what my playtime was when I ended this game, but doing my math, this route took me 75 hours, 43 minutes to complete, which is actually a good chunk longer than my previous playthrough, which was about 60 hours. And I still feel that was way too long. Because, oh my goodness, I spent a lot of time playing this game, and I only have these two playthroughs to show for it. There are certain games that I don't mind being 100-hour RPGs, like the Persona series, which this game is more or less based off of. I don't mind those being like 100-hour RPGs because I think that game justifies its length. It wants to get invested into the story, the characters, the gameplay loop, so that by the time you leave the game on your final day, it's an impactful moment to say goodbye to everyone you met across the journey. This one, for Three Houses, I don't feel it pulls off the same effect. I said earlier in the video that my opinions on Three Houses rose drastically because I played the Blue Lions, but it's not because I thought that they had the more interesting story, which they did, to be fair, but it's because I felt like I chose the wrong path to pursue on my first playthrough. It felt like the Blue Lions was the more quote-unquote canon route of the story, which leads into my discussion on spoilers. So if you have not played the Blue Lions route and you plan to, I suggest backing out of the video now so you can do that, and then you can come back here. Otherwise, we're going to start. Let's begin with addressing the theories I was making in the last video. I said that, to begin with, we talked about Byleth, and my impression of him was, at the end of the game rather, someone who was not a conscious living person by the time the game starts. I talked about how he didn't have concrete conscious memories from before he talked to Sothis at the beginning of the game, which I explained was kind of a meta way to explain why the game started when it did. Like, the reason that you started playing as Byleth right on that day is because that's when Sothis talked to you for the first time, and that's when Byleth was essentially born. Not physically, but like mentally into the world. And this playthrough more or less just affirmed that theory. Certain characters talk about how Byleth really wasn't showing emotion or had any like willingness to care about certain people or events or whatever took place. One of my favorite examples is that Dimitri talks about how when he started the year, as you were his professor, he mentions how you weren't necessarily all there, but as you began teaching that class more and more, your personality decided to come out a little bit more, and you showed more of your emotional side, which to me is like Byleth is just figuring out who he is. Like, my headcanon for why you have all these dialogue options and why it doesn't matter if you pick between one set of like kind of like good guy everyman quotes and like the kind of like snarky meaner quotes. My like headcanon for why you can fluctuate between them is Byleth is trying to figure out this whole like human side of emotions thing. Whether or not that's true doesn't matter. It's just kind of like my little headcanon there. But otherwise, yeah, Byleth was absolutely just a husk of a human being. And then when he was born, by talking to Sothis, that's when his memories officially started happening. Also, did not mention this at the beginning of the video. I absolutely noticed this on my first playthrough, but I want to talk about how so genius to have this game start on April 20th. I know it's not actually the month of April in this universe, but let's not be cute about it. This was April 20th. If you don't know the significance behind that date other than just being the weed day, April 20th is when the first Fire Emblem game was released in Japan. So there you go. A little bit of lore if you didn't know that. So after Byleth, we talked a little bit about Geralt. And if you didn't see my previous video on the Black Eagles and you don't want to be spoiled on that, I theorized that Geralt was actually a Manakete, or if you don't know, a dragon. And because of that, that explains why he looks as young as he does, because allegedly he looks just as young as he did 20 years before, when he was still at the Garreg Mach Shrine. And the reason I thought this is because no one knows Geralt's age. No one talks in absolute about Geralt's age. He even says, like, come on, if I don't know my own age, my son wouldn't know, or whatever. And no one ever talks in absolutes. Like, Rhea says that, yeah, I knew Geralt from a long time ago. In fact, I knew him before he even had facial hair. And that doesn't tell me anything. Like, how long ago was that? My headcanon is that Geralt was still a Knight of Seiros, or at least serving under her in some way during the war 1,000 years ago with Nemesis. So to give you an idea, I think that's about how old Geralt is. But I was wrong. He's not a Manakee. Alois said in his support conversation that Geralt actually let a secret slip when he was drinking, that he has some sort of crest-infused blood which prevents him from aging. So I guess something similar to the way Sedith and Flayn operate in the same universe, because that means, yeah, he has the ability to stay young. That's not necessarily indicative that he's a dragon. Probably. I'm not going to let it go completely until I'm 100% sure that is or is not the truth. But, yeah, I was probably wrong. Whatever. I'm wrong with everything. So, yeah. So now, let's talk about the Flame Emperor. So, I don't know how much I want to talk about. Actually, I think I can talk about it, because the answer is going to be the same in all three playthroughs. But in the Black Eagle's pathway, when I played through that first, I was not satisfied that Edelgard was the Flame Emperor. Actually, no. It's not that I wasn't satisfied, it's more that the game didn't convince me that Edelgard was the Flame Emperor. So when that moment came up, it was like, oh, sure, yeah, I can see it. I believe she is. But it's kind of weird that this came out of nowhere. So it makes it especially ironic that the Blue Lion's pathway did a much better job setting up and foreshadowing the twist than the Black Eagles did. And I can kind of understand why. I think the intention was that they did not want you to suspect that Edelgard was the villain behind the first part of the story. I mean, like, duh, right? However, it did it so much better. On the night of the White Heron Cup, or was it the ball and not the Heron Cup? The night of the dance, Dimitri comes up to you, talks a little bit about his history with Edelgard, says that, you know, it's kind of silly, but she eventually left back for the Empire, but when she did, I gave her a dagger as a gift, because that's a custom in the kingdom. We give a dagger to someone as a symbol of protecting yourself until we meet again. I don't remember the exact significance, but something to that effect. And then you get to hear a conversation later about how you're listening to a conversation about the Flame Emperor. She's talking to someone else. I don't remember who. Maybe it was like Solon or whatever. You and Dimitri are spying. She notices something's up, throws a dagger, and then makes an escape as sort of like a who's there, try to eliminate them, and then just leave. Dimitri looks at the dagger, is like, hold on, no way, what? But he doesn't like tell you. He's like, forget I said anything. So you can, if you're paying attention, you can put the connection 2 and 2, like, is the Flame Emperor Edelgard? So I'm actually curious. If you did play the Blue Lions first, and you didn't know, did you figure it out when the reveal happened? Did you suspect that Edelgard was the Flame Emperor? Because I can't go into that knowing, because I had that hindsight bias. I can put those pieces together right away when the moment happens. So I'm curious, because I think mileage might vary on that. Those two events don't happen so far away from each other. I think it's only about a month in game time, maybe less, that those two are spread out. So I wish they were like more separated from each other than the final game made them. But if you're playing through this game over a long period of time, maybe you might forget about that. But still, that little bit of foreshadowing is so much better than the just reveal that we got in the Black Eagles. Especially because when that chapter starts, we just get the Flame Emperor. It's not Edelgard introducing herself as the Flame Emperor. It's just the straight-up Flame Emperor raiding the Holy Tomb that you have to protect from. And then the end of the chapter happens, the mask breaks, and that is your reveal. And I like that so much more than the alternative that I got. And I understand why. It might have been a little impractical for Edelgard to be like, hold on, let me slip out into my Flame Emperor gear and then come back, and then you'll wonder, well, where is she? So I get it. I get why the reveal was handled quote-unquote poorly in the Black Eagle's pathway. But at the same time, I don't know if I want to say that this twist was set up well, but it was at least treated like a moment. There was like a legit, fully rendered 3D cutscene showing the moment that Dimitri finds out, and when he just breaks out of insanity, out of disbelief that this is actually what's happening. And then he just goes berserk on everyone, and it's awesome. Which leads us into the events following. I also said in the previous video that I wasn't a fan of the time skip because it felt like it just kind of came out of nowhere. I am officially ready to eat my words and take it back because the time split, at least in this pathway, is so much more well implemented. Because, first of all, it doesn't feel like an afterthought because it contextualizes more properly why those events took place. In the previous playthrough, it was like, oh, watch out, Professor, the building's falling. And then time skip happened. But in this pathway, you get knocked down into a canyon by the enemy, and that much more better sets up why you were in a coma for the last 5 years. And during that time, the Emperor made significant progress into going into Kingdom territory and just wrecking house. The Kingdom is in shambles by the time Part 1 starts, or by the time Part 2 starts, whereas in my playthrough, the whole continent was just at a stalemate for 5 years. So, yeah, it feels like a time skip happened. It feels like 5 years of events took place in that time. Of course, right? And unlike in my previous playthrough where you go back to the shrine after you discover it's been 5 years past, and rather than just like meeting up with Edelgard being like, "Sup, Edelgard?" You walk up the steps into the shrine, and you see Dimitri on the floor grasping his spear, and he looks up. He's like, "I can't believe this. Your ghost has come to haunt me too." Leading to so much more intrigue to figure out what's been going on since I left. Like I said, I eat my words. Part 2 is so much better in the Blue Lion's path because it feels so much more like a moment. There's a legit cutscene presenting the story here rather than just the low-budget canned animation dialogue between two characters. What I especially like is that when you get to the monastery, it's only you and Dimitri there, and you go off to fight bandits in what's left of the town. But then, as a few turns pass, some of your students show up. And then more of your students show up. And then a few more turns, and then more of your students show up. And when you talk to them, they said, "Oh, Professor, you're here too because of the promise, right?" Because 5 years ago, after the dancing ball, the students all agreed, hey, we should meet up back at the monastery for the Millennium Festival to all catch up after 5 years. And we should just meet here no matter what happens, right? And despite the world being in shambles, despite Garrick Mach being no more, they turned that throwaway line about meeting up again in 5 years and then turned it into an actual plot point to show why all the students met up here again after the 5 years. I love that. I love that little detail so much. I don't have too much to say about Part 2 on this run, as opposed to my previous ones. However, I did appreciate that it was way harder on this run than my others. I kind of just steamrolled through Part 2 on my previous playthrough, but in this one, I still had a relatively easy time, but it wasn't, like, mindless. So I appreciated that it was so much more difficult in the second part of the game. So yeah, that being said, I didn't need to kill as many of the previous students as I did in my previous playthrough. If you don't know, I did a certain strategy where if there was students from Garrick Mach on the battlefield in Part 2, I did whatever I could to avoid them, unless it was absolutely necessary to kill them. So rather than killing like the 10 or so students I did in my previous playthrough. I only killed 5 this time. And those were Ferdinand, Lorenz, Dorothea, Hubert, and Edelgard. And only four of the 5 of those were actually required for me to kill them. Dorothea, I only ended up having to kill because she was decking me with long-range magic, and my units had low res. If I wanted to get through with a somewhat easier time, I had to kill her. And that was very much heartbreaking. So I liked that the game still rewarded me for like coming up with that strategy. If you're asking why I didn't just recruit the students at the beginning of this game, I want to know and experience why or where those students show up in the different playthroughs. Only exception, I did recruit Bernadetta because the thought of actually having to fight against her would destroy me. That's the only exception I made. So with that out of the way, we can get some the bad stuff that I don't like about Part 2. And that's not a really big list either. So, like I was saying before, there's the moment where everyone meets up at the shrine because that's where they promise to reunite. Only one character isn't there, and Dimitri confirms very early on, Dedue didn't make it. He sacrificed himself so that I might live, because Dimitri was imprisoned, and, well, Dedue gave his life for him. And that is why Dimitri is so broken at the start of the game. Oh yeah, I didn't mention this, but Dimitri is depressed and broken and has an eye patch now. He did in my other run of this game. So that was awesome. I really liked playing a game where the main character was in such a state. Very uncomfortable to be around, but such an excellent study on how the decisions I made at the start of the game drastically altered this character into 2 different paths just because of that one choice I made. But that's also kind of one of my negatives as well, is because the transition of Dimitri going back into a more stable, normalized person, I think it was a little too sudden. So the real inciting incident is that Lord Rodrigue of House Fraldarius, right? He dies to protect Dimitri, and he urges him, no, you must keep going with your life. Don't let the sacrifice go in vain. And that's what inspires Dimitri to shape up his attitude. I don't mind that, but it was a little sudden. Dimitri was in such a dark state that I feel like no one would have been able to reasonably return from, but he kind of got over it rather quickly. So I would have preferred a little bit more of an A to Z rather than the A to B we got, if that makes any sense. And one of the missed opportunities of helping with that is the point I was trying to make before I got into a tangent about how broken Dimitri was, is that Dedue wasn't actually dead. Dimitri said, yeah, he died for me, but he wasn't actually dead. He was saved by other people of Dusker, his home nation, and that led him to find Dimitri again. But that's the thing. He just shows up out of nowhere. It's not foreshadowed. It's not given its own moment, perhaps where Dedue saves Dimitri from an oncoming attack or whatever. It just happens. He's like, oh, I'll explain it later. So, no. I don't care that Dimitri's alive. I prefer that, to be honest. But I was so fascinated that I thought this game had the balls to kill off one of the supporting members so integral to the character of Dimitri, but to also just bring him back like nothing ever happened. Like I said, if Dedue had a moment where he saved Dimitri, I think that would have been a significant crack into the broken persona he had developed over all those years, and how Rodrigue's death would help further that to him being a normal person again. But I think it was just poorly handled. And that's unfortunate. Kind of related. where one of my complaints is that Dedue isn't dead, my other complaint is that Rhea is not dead. And for a completely different purpose. I would have much preferred it if Rhea sacrificed herself to save you, but it was sort of in vain because you kind of got knocked down the canyon anyway. But no, she's just captured the whole game, and you're trying to find out where she is, but it's not like it's a huge part of the story to find her. It's just kind of a sort of motivator to do it, but it's not important, if that makes sense. So she has no impact, and it's so unfortunate. So I honestly kind of wish that either they did more with her to justify trying to find your way to her, or that they just kill her. Because even when you rescue her, she does nothing in the story. She doesn't even show up at all. And that is so much of a wasted opportunity. It's like, come on. Give me something here. You have so much you can do with her, but you do nothing. Oh boy, is that infuriating. And this is a minor complaint. You can't recruit anyone new when you get to part 2. It's whoever you have at the end of part 1. That's your roster going forward. I don't super mind that, but I wish that you had the opportunity to recruit some of the other characters that you do meet in part 2 that are your allies. I did have that in part 1, or my first playthrough, rather. I had that issue in my first playthrough, but I didn't super mind it. I don't super mind it here either. I just kind of wish that you had the opportunity to recruit those allies. But, again, I don't really care so much. So I think we can talk about the ending now. So, because of the character change that Dimitri goes through, I like that he actually made an honest effort to try to solve the war diplomatically. To say, hey, Edelgard, let's talk this out. If nothing comes of it, whatever, but let's give ourselves the opportunity to end this with as little bloodshed as we can before we actually go at it. Of course, that doesn't work, so we have to actually go to the final map, which is still not labeled Endgame, so I feel better about that in my previous playthrough, but why not name it Endgame? Why be cute about it? Why name it Chapter 20 or Chapter 18 or whatever? Just name it Endgame, man. Come on. I'm not a super big fan of the final map. I didn't hate it. I didn't hate the last one either, but it's not my favorite final levels in the Fire Emblem series. Probably not even at the top either. But at the same time, it's fine. I didn't really like that Edelgard eventually resorted to using a crest to stop you. So, like, this was established much earlier in the story. If you, like, use a crest stone, but you're not, like, attributed to that crest, or you're not adapted for it, or something like that, you turn into a monster. And that's exactly what Edelgard did. She used the crest to turn into a monster to stop you. I kind of wish she didn't. It feels a little out of character for her, as someone who is trying to build a world to not rely on crest and to downplay their importance in society. It wasn't, like, so egregious that I couldn't, like, justify it in any way. Like, of course, it's a last resort. If she doesn't do this, her empire is fallen. So, like, why not use every tool at her disposal? But at the same time, it's like, why would she use it? It kind of undermines the story when the human character you're fighting, and I address this, the human complex character that you're fighting just turns into a monster at the end. It's a little off-putting, to be honest, but whatever. And then once you defeat her, Dimitri again tries to extend a hand in forgiveness, but not in trust, because Edelgard tries to make the final move. Dimitri beats her to the punch. And then the story just ends. Just like in the last playthrough, the story ends at that last cutscene. You get to learn what Dimitri does now that he's king. You get to learn what you're doing now that the war is over. And that's your ending. And then you get whoever you shipped with at the end of the game. You get that cutscene as well. I hate these endings. I hate them so much. What I love most about the Fire Emblem games in the past is the slower talking with everyone, learning kind of what the state of the continent is going to be now that the war is over, directly from their mouths. I know that having that mural at the end of the game accomplishes that same thing, but it feels so unsatisfactory and inconclusive for me. And I guess the reason I have a problem with the endings of this game as much as I do is because despite playing this game for all this time, I still don't know the full story. I have over 130 hours logged into this game. This is the most played game on my Switch, and yet I don't know the full story. I still don't know what the deal with Nemesis is. Like, I know the truth according to the Empire behind Nemesis in my playthrough of that, but I don't know what his deal is. I don't know what the Red Canyon incident is about. I don't know a lot of these little things that aren't adding up to me, and I know that if I maybe play the other routes in this game, then I'll really know. But at the same time, I've been playing this game for 130 hours. It's so frustrating to not know the full story. I could have finished all 3 routes of Fates twice over in the time it took me to do half of the possible playthrough of this game. My length for Three Houses is this game's biggest problem for me. It feels much, much, much too long of a video game. Now, I do want to be clear on something. Just because I have these frustrations with the story and the gameplay at large as well, doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it. And just because I said at the top of the video that I'd probably rank this in the lower half of my series rankings, doesn't mean I didn't enjoy this game. But there's these frustrations that are truly preventing me from feeling like this game is absolutely deserving of being called one of the best Fire Emblem games. And I gotta be honest, it's those reasons I can't help but feeling just a little disappointed. And with that, that is the end of the video. That's all the things I had to discuss on Fire Emblem Three Houses. And yeah, that's it for now. We'll be back with the Golden Deer whenever I get to finishing that route of the game. I don't know when that's going to be, though. I am feeling a little burnt out on this game, so I'm probably going to play some other games to refresh my palate and go in. I did start the playthrough, but I don't know when I'll finish it. So yeah, that's going to be what's going on for that. If you have any questions about something I said, I know my opinions on this game were very jumbled, so feel free to comment. We can have a discussion about it down there in the comments. I'm absolutely willing to debate certain things and to change my perspective if need be. So yeah, feel free to say your piece if you do. Other than that, we'll meet back with Golden Deer, possibly Fire Emblem Fates retrospective, not too far off in the future. Hopefully by the start of next month, that video will be done. But yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you with the Golden Deer, and see you next time.